Okay, so I am excited to be here with you this afternoon to talk about the inner-city bus study. The first thing I want to ask, who has heard of the inner-city bus study? Today, all right. Who ever read the 2010 inner-city bus study? Oh, we got the real committed folks up here in front. So the bottom line is that I'm working Cady, Dawson with Felsberg, Holt, and Olivig, and we are actually working, I'm pinch hitting today for the prime consultant, David Evans and Associate. They couldn't be here today, but working with UDOT to update this plan. And so the goal today is really just to kind of talk through the purpose of the plan, why it's important, what UDOT's role is, and also kind of where we're in the study and get some feedback from you all, if appropriate, if you have other ideas and considerations you want to put on the table for us today. So with that, I am going to jump in and give a little bit of an overview. I said that it was last updated in 2010, which I feel like seems like an eternity ago. I'm like 2010, 13 years ago. So obviously it's an opportunity to update the study, really understand what has changed. There's a lot of providers that were operating that are no longer operating. And the inner-city bus study is also a requirement of the Federal Transit Administration to really understand what those funding needs and gaps are to allocate those funds to the state. So not only is it a requirement and it's a little bit outdated, but it also provides really strategic direction to UDOT and the team as to where do we want to invest our money, what are the key projects and strategies, how are we going to kind of advance this through the state process. So needless to say, it was time, and so we kicked off, I guess in the spring probably. And I wanted to really touch on why the inner-city bus study is important. Yes, it's a requirement. Yes, it's outdated. Yes, it guides UDOT. However, when I think about transportation planning, it's all about the user, right? And I'm sure you guys all feel the same way. It is, at the end of the day, you feel good about what you do because you're providing rides to people who need it, getting people where they need to go. And in terms of the inner-city bus study, there's one component that it connects the national network, right, of inner-city buses. So you could get from Seattle to Denver, or you can get, from New York. So, that's great that you have this whole connection. But it also starts parsing together those different connections for people within different regions of states, right? So there is that access to medical, where there's long-distance trips where rural folks are living, getting to employment, getting to education. In Utah, there's a big lens on recreation, as well as the medical appointments, as I'm sure many of you know. It's kind of what are those critical services we want to get people to, getting them also to social services, but then also providing mobility options, right? That people don't have to drive in their single occupant vehicle or in a car with folks if there was another option available to them that they could utilize. And then ultimately, I think in this room, I'm preaching to the choir, but by having all of those mobility options at the end of the day, what we're really doing is, I think, improving quality of life for everyone that needs access to things and places and friends and social networks and all of those things to make their lives better. So in particular, for the actual 2023 inner-city bus study, there's the overarching that we talked on about why this is important. But for this project in general, what are we actually trying to achieve, right? What are the goals? And critical to this, I think, is looking at this as the perspective of the vision. What is the actual vision? Where are we trying to go? Yes, we have this service today, and being a transportation planner, I often say, it's real hard to get people engaged in long-range planning, right? We're worried about getting those buses out today, getting people where they need to go, making sure they're operating, they're not breaking down, all of those things. But it's also really important that planning happens and that we're really being strategic about our future and where are we really trying to go. And I will say, the side note is I'm from Colorado, but the thing I would say about that is Colorado has really developed this, they call it Bustang and Outrider, which is kind of a state-operated inner-city kind of bus intra-regional. It's kind of a whole network of things. But it was a vision that they had created 15 years ago, and it has really come to fruition, right? And I think sometimes when we plan, we're like, oh, here we go again, talking about something that's never going to be real. But I think it's these little incubator ideas, and when people have these conversations, that provides this opportunity for growth and vision. So part of this is, what's our vision? How can we really grow and expand, and what does that look like for Utah? And again, also really understanding how this network connects with regional services, local services, the different mobility hubs. How are we really integrating this into the fabric of the transit network that already exists, whether it's fixed route service, demand response, human services providers, right? Senior centers, getting people to these more intercity or regional service providers to get them where they need to go. So the other piece is, you have the vision, right? And you kind of work backward. How do we actually get there, and understanding the gaps and needs, creating that prioritized plan and kind of that phased implementation. And being a planner, I love doing strategic plans and implementation plans, because it's where the rubber really meets the road, right? You've got these ideas, but now let's break it down into pieces and really be specific about, this is the project, this is the action, this is who's responsible, here's the time frame for implementation, that you really have these pieces that are more manageable, that people can take on to really start driving that direction towards that long-range vision. And then lastly, it enables the rural public transit team to really have, again, those action items to know where they're going. I always feel like in life, we all kind of have, you go down this path, you're somewhere here, but if you know where you're trying to get, the likelihood that you'll get there is much higher. Okay, so I'm going to pause there. I don't want to just preach at you all. Do you have any comments or questions or anything kind of on the basics and the foundation of intercity bus? And then we'll get into some details. No? Y'all just had lunch, tired, it's Friday. Okay. So I think importantly for all of you is kind of understanding the roles and responsibilities. So what is UDOT's role? UDOT is the one that manages and allocates the FTA 5311F funding. So I'm sure most of you know about 5311 funding, right? Going once. I'm like, you people raise your hands. I know you do. But the 5311F is the actual intercity funding that comes from the US DOT, from FTA. So the part of the circular and the requirement is 15% of the annual general 5311 apportionment that goes to Utah must go to the intercity bus study. There is an opportunity to have that at a lower threshold. Currently, UDOT does the 15%. If it were to go down, it has to have approval by the governor's office. So, this is part of the considerations as you're developing your vision and your priorities. Like, how does this all align with the different apportionments, different funding sources, and how do you kind of look at this holistically to really kind of figure out what your actionable items are to get to your vision? So in terms of the actual 5311F funding, this is directly from the circular as well. Kind of what are the priorities and the purposes of this funding? So connecting, and there's a couple of key things here, connecting non-urbanized areas to the larger regional national system of intercity bus, right? So how do you feed it all together and make it happen? Supporting service to meet the intercity travel needs of residents in non-urbanized areas. So that's what I was talking about before, right? Like, you have a big network, but you also have this other opportunity to capture people and meet needs on a more regional basis in the rural areas. The project types that are available under this 5311F funding are planning, marketing assistance, capital investments, and capital for infrastructure investments. So kind of the span of things to really make the service happen. So in terms of the actual study elements, I think I had mentioned at the beginning, we started kind of mid-late spring, and there's these, key planning tasks going into understanding what is happening today, making sure you're engaging your stakeholders. That is another big thing from the circular, is making sure you're engaging with stakeholders, with the intercity bus providers, to make sure you're really advancing to where you want to go and getting to those needs. assessing and really understanding what are your gaps and needs. You know, is it service types? Is it days of service? Is it getting to certain places? Your geography, there's a lot of considerations, and I'll touch on those in a little bit as well. And then assessing the intercity bus performance. So how is it operating today? What are those ridership trends? What are those numbers? How do they inform potential recommendations as we move forward? And then going into an actual evaluation and prioritization. So once we come up with some recommendations, it's, okay, how are we evaluating them? What are the most important factors and criteria that the state of Utah is interested in as you advance towards your vision network, which really informs how those recommendations will move forward. And then in terms of timing, the anticipated end date for this project is December of 2023, which is scarily just a couple of months away. Not because of the project, but because I feel like time is passing by really fast. I was telling Elena last night, I don't think August existed. It just started and ended, and then I woke up. Okay, so again, I will pause there. Any questions about Intercity Bus 5311F funding? Yes.
One question I had is just a barrier I can picture is if a person, let's say, was in Canab and they wanted to go to Salt Lake City, I can see them taking a bus to maybe Cedar City and then maybe another bus to Provo and then connecting onto UTA, and I would imagine I could pay for each leg of that trip. So is that something that they look at of trying to coordinate that a little better so that somebody's not paying exorbitant amounts of money just, with all the different...
Yeah. So and you can jump in if there's something specific being done on that front as of now for Utah. So mobility as a service software platforms where it's an opportunity. So CDOT is working with a provider. Well, it was supposed to be Masabi, but things are changing. But anyway, the intention is they've been really doing this whole inventory process where they've been pulling and collecting data from GTFS, from all of the transit providers across rural Colorado and the urban areas. And they are creating a consolidated platform where people can buy all of their trips and connections through this one mobility app. I know this, of course, then there's but you need to be able to pay cash, and depending on who the riders are, and that's all considered in there as well. But there are, Colorado, I know for sure, and I know in regions specifically that this is something where people are really working towards. So I think it is a gap, or it's a barrier, like you said, of, well, how do I navigate the trip and all these fares and different can I just get on, pay my thing, and end up where I need to be, right? And without a lot of transfers. So yes, it is technology that is available in the industry and a lot of people are implementing, but I think it's something we can absolutely put in as a consideration for kind of advancing that integration and payment moving in the...
This is kind of a farther example, but I know in Europe, in my experience, many European countries have, they have lots of different trains and buses and systems, and they'll have a pass that you can buy, Swiss pass, and then get to anywhere in Switzerland.
If only we could catch up with Europe.
Even when I was living in New Jersey, you just go to New York City, you had to pay one fare onto New Jersey Transit, and then maybe PATH, that's another fare in the New York City subway.
Yep.
So even though you can get there on rail, it's how many fares am I paying, and all these different agencies. Mm-hmm. It can be a barrier both for cost or also just figuring it out.
Yeah.
I think that just intimidates people.
Yeah.
I don't want to get lost.
Well, or even just not even the fare payment, but a consolidated trip planner, right? How do you navigate your full journey through one app and then understand all the fare payment too?
Which is why the interlining world is so important
Mm-hmm.
in the city, the nationwide intercity bus network. But you have to remember that we go hundreds of miles without passing through a city, and you don't do that in Europe. It really changes the schematics of what they can do there and what we can do here, because from Kanab to Salt Lake City, you're kind of remote out here as far as not putting on a lot of miles to get to some urban area.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Kathy, do you want to tell I don't know if everyone knows you here. You want to kind of at least give a little intel of your perspective?
Salt Lake Express, so we do the inner study in 6 states. So Washington, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, and Nevada. And we go through a little bit of Arizona.
Well, and I think it's a good point too, like, well, you're covering a lot of states, right? And one of the things is Salt Lake Express. I think, nationally, right? What are all these technology and innovation opportunities at a national level? Like, and, I know there's lots of studies and research and all sorts of things that are being done, but it's how do we get all those pieces to come together and, across providers, across geographies, across state lines, we know how hard it is. People don't care if they're crossing between, one county and another. They're like, just get me where I need to go. So how do we make this easy for everyone?
It also has been really helpful.
Yes.
For people who are like, I don't even know who to call.
Yes.
You can Google it, or you can go to Google Transit, and it'll show you the different operators along the way from beginning to end of your trip.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
That was a little bit along the lines of what my question was. You're saying this study is to study how to bring Utah's connections to get you to be able to connect to that larger regional system and the national system. How is the health of that larger regional/national system? I know that Greyhound recently made a lot of changes, and I'm not sure they're for the better. They don't have hubs where you go anymore and you just pick up at certain places, and you have to use an app to figure it out, or even request to pick up. What is the health of the national system?
Yes, I totally concur on the Greyhound front. Like, I know that in Colorado we've taken over Greyhound routes, the busting has, but I don't know if our FTA folks in the House have are there kind of from the national perspective in terms of kind of what's moving forward, the priorities, the planning, kind of how it all integrates?
I don't have anything to add right now.
I don't really, we just had a state programs meeting, and unfortunately I wasn't in attendance, so, I think just for inner city, there's not really any specific priority, but I think always the general priority is how can we connect as many people as possible, and how can we connect people by public transit and get them where they need to go.
Right.
And so we've been working with all the states in our region to ensure that everyone is, at states, each state is keeping their rural inner city bus services, their studies updated, that they're current, that they're working collaboratively with the inner city, working collaboratively with and reaching out to the inner city providers that go through their state.
Right.
And if they don't have a lot of, this is not just for Utah, but if they didn't have a lot of inner city providers, making sure that they're reaching out and trying to find people who might be interested in doing that service.
Yeah.
So we are trying to work to help.
Kind of coordinate and collaborate all the.
But we don't really have like a specific priority or initiative beyond what we normally.
Right. Well, and I mean, it's the point of the study, right? Like the money gets allocated to the states, and then it's kind of what are your gaps and needs and what are your priorities. But appreciate that there is a larger kind of how does that all work and navigate.
Each state has to certify that they're spending at least 15% of their funds on inner city bus.
Yeah. Jason?
Yeah, I guess kind of piggybacking on that, the status of Greyhound. Is the in-kind funding still a piece of the puzzle as well? If you're connecting to the Greyhound hub and the in-kind process that they used to offer back in the day?
I don't know that I know the answer to that.
Okay.
Well, I think every provider does it differently. We used to use Greyhound as in kind, but we got so large that we could use our own.
Oh, interesting.
subsidized miles
Yeah.
and in-kind more naturally.
Yeah.
So that's what we use.
Okay.
Right, because we
That
have
makes
enough
sense.
unsubsidized
That's
to
right.
cover that. But in this Greyhound thing, I don't know if everybody understands, they were purchased, it was about a year ago, wasn't it, Elena? They were purchased by Flix, and Flix is a European company that expanded to the United States and slowly really wanted to be aggressive in expanding their service throughout the United States. The problem is they don't understand how rural we are. And so after they took over Greyhound, they have continued to drop boarding locations in smaller rural towns if it doesn't make sense. financially, they don't do it.
Mhm.
And which is really sad because if you're going by a town, it's ridiculous to not just
Right.
offer a stop there. The same with the terminals. If it doesn't make sense, they just shut them down and don't even stop there, even if it's a major. Right now, Greyhound doesn't stop in Salt Lake.
Mhm.
They don't have a boarding location in Salt Lake. They're stopping curbside like we are, but that is going away. So we have a real problem in Salt Lake making the connection to Greyhound, as we're neither one of us in that Greyhound station anymore in Salt Lake.
They're not at the intermodal? You're concerned?
They're shopping there.
No.
So it's a real problem.
Well, and I think you bring up a really good point, which comes into the state study, right? And I feel like this, especially in any rural planning, not even just inner city, but what is your goal? Like, what are you trying to achieve? Because if you're trying to carry as many passengers as possible, it's going to be really hard. So is it about moving a number of people, or is it providing access to people who need to get to where they go, right? So it's that balancing act. But when you're private, right, your goal is when many people as possible, and so there's all these trade-offs that come up, of course, as you study it. So, okay. So I am going to just jump into a couple of the tasks that we've started with to kind of give you guys an idea of what we've done and where we're headed. The existing conditions, total traditional planning exercise, kind of understanding what your existing landscape is, what kind of the state of the system is. So there's been a lot of work kind of just understanding the inner city bus providers and the local and regional transit providers. And I say that, yes, it's focused on inner city, but you also need to understand those critical links. And then also, like, who are all the local providers that are kind of pushing into that service? Do you have a really small senior center, or do you have a pretty sizable, fixed route network? And you need to be thinking about mobility hubs and kind of locations, how all those pieces and parts are going to come together. So really understanding the full landscape of transit across the rural portions of the state is really important. So we've done an inventory on that. And then the other real big key that informs, a transit planning study is kind of the market analysis. So there's been a lot of data collection and a lot of efforts that have been completed to really understand, in most markets, it's what is the population and employment, and often kind of what are those densities, because we know transit is, the more people you have, it's hard to stop when you have, 2 people, but what is the need? So understanding kind of current and future, kind of those projected population estimates out to, I think we did 2040 or 2045, and just kind of seeing, are there real hot spots that emerge when you turn these map layers on and off to understand, we should really be concentrating or thinking about this area as we develop our recommendations. Key activity centers, again, this is medical, education, social services, it's correctional facilities. It's kind of anywhere these folks are really trying to go and getting those connections, and where do we need to make sure, are they either being served today, or do we need to consider serving them in the future? Historically disadvantaged populations, of course, really important, understanding, as we move forward, and I know there was conversation in the grant session yesterday, there's Justice 40, and really kind of trying to look at all these different factors and make sure we're considering different things in our analysis. So I'll show you a map here in a minute of some of the things we've been doing for that. And then commuter trip patterns, just a component of this, but also important, like where are people going to and from? So we did a kind of origin destination analysis to understand kind of county to county trip flows. So how many people work in the county that they live in, how many are traveling to an adjacent county, and then are there folks that live and work in those locations and vice versa. So really trying to understand, are there high kind of demand needs that could maybe be served as a part of these recommendations. So of course there's a lot more to this, but this is kind of the key elements that we've inventoried and went into. So when we talk about the primary intercity bus providers, Greyhound, we mentioned Mountain States Express, Salt Lake Express, and St. George Express. And here I highlighted Salt Lake Express. That is the program that is actually currently funded with the 5311F funds from UDOT. So it's I mean, am I want to talk about the numbers? It's all public. It's like 1.2, 1.5 million?
Yeah, that's about right.
So, when you think about 15%, right, of whatever your total 5311 is, and so it's a portion of that, but I always say too, it's like, well, that seems like a lot of money, but when you're providing transit service, it doesn't actually go that far when you're thinking about how many the routes, the miles, the time, those labor hours on the road. So definitely opportunity as we move forward.
I guess I'll just say the 2 routes that we currently fund are Salt Lake to Vernal, right, and Salt Lake to Glen, right? So those are very long routes, right, that Salt Lake Express provides for us.
So on that, I'm just trying to understand how this works. So you're allowed to hire not a for-profit organization because they're the only provider? Is that
No,
how
we
this
did an
works?
RFP for.
Okay, so you're bidding out the services.
Correct.
Okay, that makes sense.
And they do currently have.
Okay. So then do we look at when you're doing a study? I mean, you're doing an inventory, so I guess you are looking at, are there nonprofit agencies or what that can fill in the maybe between 2 small towns? I don't know. Is that something you look at?
Well, this is definitely looking at a little bit higher level. I think, if there was another kind of statewide study that really looked at every component, this one's just really focused on that inner city, for ultimate recommendations and priorities. I think as you go through this, you realize there's these other gaps and needs and potential service providers, but that would be kind of another level of a study, I think, to get into the kind of real detail of how you would do that. I think from a funding or an operational perspective, you put out the RFP, and I feel like the service providers are constantly changing too, but there may be folks that could be more integral in that process or other opportunities for folks to provide the service.
One follow-up question, sorry.
No.
And when we're looking at inner city, are we counting national parks? I just know on a national level that's kind of theme, especially when you look at equity and things like that are we looking at opportunities for people, low-income people, colored people, disabilities? Do they have those abilities from, say, a metropolitan area or the Wasatch Front to get to Zion's National Park or Capitol, wherever they're trying to go?
Right.
I know that is that part of this?
So the recreation component is definitely been kind of inventoried as a part of the existing conditions. Don't touch the cord, people. I know, I gesticulate a lot too, so there's that. So the recreation is absolutely a component of consideration in terms of the activity centers. I think that when you really dig down, I think because of the limited amount of funds and kind of what you're trying to achieve with the inner city is kind of connecting the rural to those urbanized areas, that ends up being the focus. But I think that, I just worked on another study that there was a lot of, it was like a 7-county rural study, and it was a lot about, well, how do we get people to the sand dunes, And it ended up that we kind of came up with specific recommendations in there for, are there, partnerships with the Chamber of Commerce or with, some of the economic groups, because it is part of the economic drive as well, right? So I think you're totally spot on that there are all these recreation centers, but I think it's order of magnitude too. When you really start prioritizing, and go through an evaluation of, if you had 2 against each other, one was going to get people to the grocery store and doctors and medical, and one gets, where does the state prioritize their funds being so limited, right? So, but I think there's considerations and lots of ways to look at that at other levels of planning. So, okay, so the other thing I wanted to highlight in here is just kind of for perspective is the other 5311 funded UDOT providers in the state of Utah. So listed these here, and then this is kind of the overarching existing network. I will say this map, I had thought I got an updated version, but it should have Greyhound coming in along I-70 and also from I-80 up there too. So those are missing on there. But I think just kind of when you look at the overall perspective, and everyone knows we all came to Kanab, right? Like there's a lot of miles, there's a lot of rural area, and it's really, really expensive to provide the service. So the other thing I wanted to highlight, which kind of gets to when you were talking about equity, is one of the things that has been developed for UDOT as a part of this is kind of an interactive GIS tool. So it has kind of the base map, right, and the existing service and whatnot, but then there's also a whole bunch of other data built in there in terms of those disadvantaged populations. And the map that you see here is transit equity or equity populations. So this is basically you take, whether it's older adults, people of color, low income, kind of your main factors, aggregate them together and basically create a scale that pulls it all into this. So you can see that, you know, you kind of have the darker the color, the higher the propensity of those equity populations. So again, when you start merging these things and turning layers on and off, there's an opportunity to see, like, well, if we did this recommendation, would it have a better or higher impact on those equity populations, right? So this is an internal tool that UDOT is a part of this, where it's kind of helping inform evaluation and information moving forward. So again, another part of that kind of existing conditions that also informs the analysis and the evaluation moving forward. There's a lot of words on here, you don't have to read them. But stakeholder engagement, they're kind of as a part of this, again, making sure you're interacting with the providers and the people in the community and getting that input. We held the first stakeholder engagement meeting in June. And it was really kind of a project kickoff, kind of get everyone oriented to what we're doing, the project, the schedule, the desired outcomes. And then there'll be another meeting with this group in October to really kind of go through what's kind of come out as those gaps and needs, what those potential recommendations are, and to kind of vet those with the stakeholders to get additional input on priorities. So existing conditions, right, you end up going into a gaps and needs assessment, and this is kind of where we are. But the gaps and needs is really you're tying together the stakeholder input, you're tying together all that existing conditions data, pairing it together with what you heard, kind of understanding ridership trends and kind of, you know, even historical, I think in Utah is really important because there is a lot of historical service that has been provided. Are there things that, you know, didn't last, but they should have? It was, you know, some factor that warranted the discontinuation of that service. But I think in terms of this gaps and needs in opportunities, there are some key things that kind of real high level have risen to the top. But I think it's important to remember that it's not just new needs for intercity bus. So in the nerdy transit world, right, we talk about geographic coverage, we talk about temporal coverage, right? When the service is being provided, do you need to, you know, start operating earlier and later into the day? Do you need to, you know, really make sure those frequencies are on point depending on how frequent you're providing the service during the day? So these were a couple, and again, I know there are some services that operate, but it is kind of, do you need to bolster it? Is that the highest priority opportunity right now in UDOT, or for Utah, that will move into kind of that evaluation stage? And then I'll pause again here. Any other questions or comments? And we have a more generic kind of at the end. I was hoping to just gaps and needs discussion with you all, but we can talk about that too. Yeah.
I think the big gating pole I saw on that map was the Navajo Nation area. Are there additional challenges, or I would assume there are, but what are those additional challenges? Trying to get connectivity into there?
Yeah, so
Those other areas?
yeah, and we have reached out to the tribes as a part of this effort. And then, you know, additionally, the tribes also have tribal transit plans. And so I think, you know, it's how do you connect all those dots and making sure that communication and those same connections are happening. And I guess I don't know, I apologize, I don't know enough about the tribal, like, service here.
Navajo Nation did have a kind of service down there, or they're not currently operating it. And so, you know, it would be something that, you know, we could definitely look at, but as far as them being the provider to connect.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sounds like that's probably where the breakdown happened. They did have the service,
They did.
and that's not there, and now we're still trying to figure out how to catch that.
And you know, we drive through a lot of tribal areas throughout our routes, and as I work with them, I've come to realize it's a culture thing. They don't want people leaving their their local area. They want them to stay there, and worry when transit comes through there.
Mhm.
That's what I was told in one area, and as I couldn't figure out why we never had any rides from that area. So we pulled it as a stop because 2 or 3 people a year is enough to have a stop there.
Mhm.
I've just noticed when I've driven through New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, there's tons of them on the road hitchhiking. So I mean, the need's obviously there. But
Mhm.
I don't know how you get hitchhiking into transit.
Right. Well, yeah, in New Mexico, we actually just worked on the North Central Transit Region, NCRTD, Regional Transit District. So it's kind of 4 counties in the northern part of New Mexico, but they also did their tribal transit plan concurrently. And so we were able to have a lot of that interaction between both and really opening those lines of communication. But I think that is another component, is like you were saying, is you have to be really conscientious about how you're communicating, how you're engaging with the tribes. And, you know, we had somebody from New Mexico on our team that was really kind of that liaison to work on creating that trust and creating that opportunity of the trusted advisor to integrate into the process. So again, it's a whole, but it's how does it all connect together, right? And it's complicated.
Sounds like there's a cultural barrier as well.
Yeah. But so much opportunity. See, like, I'm so glass half full. Like, but there's so much opportunity.
I drove through Gallup, but I counted maybe 10 hitchhikers.
Yeah.
I thought, wow, there's a need for sure.
Yeah. Well, in the comfort level, like it's always like in, you know, resort communities too, I'm always like, everybody's just out here, everybody trusts everybody. And, you know, like it is kind of what that expectation and comfort is, right? So, yeah.
On the cultural differences there, you look at Uinta Basin area, and Uinta Basin has transit that goes throughout the area, but each tribe has transit, and you still see the hitchhiking in that area, even though they're covered very well.
Yeah. Isn't it? Yeah. Well, and it's part of the, right? It becomes an element of what's the education, what's the engagement, how do you, you know, break down some of those barriers, and is it the priority, right? Again, given limited resources, it's always like, how do you balance all of the things? So
I was just wondering with the funding, how realistic it is to say that the inner city bus is going to link in regionally. I mean, right here, this is all Utah, right? But I think of places like, okay, but if you're in St. George, is it easier to get to Las Vegas than come all the way to Salt Lake or something? Is it, you know, you've got Moab and Four Corners in those areas, we're closer to Grand Junction. I mean,
yeah.
And so I'm just asking, like, I mean, I'm at least aware of how our funding is. We don't have the ability to do anything regional.
Right.
It has to stay in Utah. And so
Yep.
I'm just curious how either federal government sees that or how the funding can work so that if you needed to cross the border into another state, how does that work if you're really trying to connect inner city bus to inner city bus?
Yeah, and Kathy and I actually had lunch together yesterday, and we were talking about this of, you know, so in Colorado, there is now it used to be a Greyhound route, but it goes from Union Station in Denver up I-70 and then up 40 to Steamboat Springs. You serve Vernal, right? So there's this little tiny gap of how do you make that connection, right? And I think there have been discussions historically of, you know, what are the opportunities? Could there be a partnership or a collaboration in, you know, with Utah and Colorado to figure out how do you break down that barrier? But I mean, it requires creative thinking and strategic partnerships
And that's what we did with Idaho and Montana. Montana funds the point from Great Falls to the Idaho-Montana border, and then Idaho funds the part from the Idaho border down to where we're self-funded to Idaho Falls, because once we leave Idaho Falls, we've got plenty of ridership.
Yep.
But it's that gap that has low ridership that both states came together and funded, you know,
Yep.
so that we could make it happen.
Yeah. And like that Utah example, I think it's, well, what's the data? Like, is there a need, first of all, right? And Colorado would have to figure out, in Utah, are there people trying to get each direction? So, but I mean, point well taken. It's definitely complex and a lot of different considerations.
Well, I think that is the whole idea behind the study, is to figure out what can we do to make it better? Where are these gaps? And here is the data that I, as Salt Lake Express, can use to say, okay, Utah, will you fund to the border here? And because if you do, Colorado will do this. And so this gives us the tools we need to make that happen.
Yeah, or at least even the recommendation, right, of let's advance further the conversations to determine what that means. Peter?
Cady, would your study have been able to identify, say, a travel demand between St. George and Las Vegas?
I don't think that we went into, I mean, I know that we have kind of the understanding of the network, right? Like that goes outside of the state lines, but I don't know, I mean, the ridership, and being totally candid, ridership's real hard to get from intercity providers, right? So it's, I'm like, Kathy, I got you right here now. Yeah, go ahead, Cindy.
I have a question. So I know that the state has allocated funds for tourism hotspot areas. Can any of those funds be, now this is the question for you or maybe other people.
I know, you.
Can any of those funds be used to pay for operation of transit services?
Yeah, do you know anything about that?
Well, I know we're using some hotspot funds for MOAB startup.
Okay.
So it's possible.
Yeah.
And then there's some state funds that are going this spring to go. Is that a hotspot?
Yeah.
So it's possible.
Yeah.
I was just thinking of the broader issues around tourism
Yeah.
and getting people to national
Yep.
parks, sort of within the scope of the intercity bus service, but sort of out of the scope too, and like how do you really address that? Because there are people who come from other countries and they don't.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I've been shocked in Kanab.
Yeah.
Just the international tourism here. It's
Right.
crazy.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's an expectation that you might be able to do some of that international tourism without having to rent your own vehicle.
Yeah, and I think that, and Elena and I will have to, I'm hoping Elena's taking notes or some, I'm like, I don't have any paper up here. But I think that, these are these great points that I think could feed into, other conversations in the document itself, like things to consider that are really important that may not be funded through the 5311F program, right? However, what about this? What about this? The tourism funds, the hotspots, the recreation. So I think those are great points, for sure.
And I think even having some type of clearinghouse, like was said earlier with different providers, is we're back to kind of having a little conversation about Christy's question about Salt Lake to St. George, and there's actually a lot of providers that provide that service if you don't know it.
Now, Google Transit is where people should go because they list them all there, and they even have a link that you can click on to go to that.
That already gives people to find out.
Okay, I didn't think we'd be able to talk for an hour, people, and here we are. You guys are awake and engaged and everything. Thank you. I know, right? So the kind of next steps, because I do think we only have an hour, so I'll chop here. We have that other stakeholder meeting in October. Did anyone in this room, who participated in the June meeting? A couple of you back there. Okay, awesome. So another one is coming up, so you'll be getting word about that. Finalize the assessment of existing intercity bus service providers. So maybe, Kathy, we can connect on getting some additional data. But, we're really trying to understand, and I think it's to that point of getting across lines or really just understanding. Again, we can get info from NTD and on the rural providers, but it's a little harder when they're not all getting 5311F funding. And then from there, kind of as we alluded to, kind of those high level kind of opportunities, we will start really going through an evaluation, developing those performance metrics, again, of how are we selecting priorities? And again, is it we just want ridership, or is it because we know that there's a gap and a need for a certain population or for a certain service that needs to be accessed? So kind of developing some evaluation criteria for that. And then the anticipation is the final recommendations and, like I said, the report by the end of the year. So moving right along and trying to get across the finish line. I feel like we've kind of been doing this all along the way, but would totally entertain any other kind of gaps, needs, questions, things that have been on your mind or have come up while you've been sitting here thinking through this conversation.
My mind has been going public versus private. Way back when trolleys started or whatever, they were private and people ran them. Well, that's great until it becomes not.
Yep.
And public transit, it can't really be private very many places.
Mhm.
Is that kind of the way that we're going? I don't know the hybrid that you were talking about. Dan. Well, it's funded by Idaho up here and Montana up here, but then at this point, we can run that and it pays for itself by the number of passengers we have.
And that piece is what we use for our in-kind match.
Okay.
So like say for example, we go from Salt Lake down to Reno every day through Elko. But our piece from Salt Lake City to Wendover is our in-kind match miles. So we don't have to come up with cash match like you guys have to. We use those in-kind match miles because it connects with
The larger
subsidized
network.
service. And then Nevada funds that from the Nevada-Utah border at Wendover all the way down to Reno.
So does the Utah legislature maybe need to, Utah Transit Authority is authorized by the Utah legislature to provide service in a certain area. Do they need to make an entity that is over a network and they have a network and then they bid out to people like Salt Lake City Express and get them to provide service in that area? But then they have more resources going into it that the 53 allows that to be able to pay for more service? Is that
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the bottom line is, right, the 15%, if you really want this comprehensive, like, intercity service, you're not going to, dare I say that, like you guys know, not going to happen with 15%, right? So,
Well, and 15% is a minimum.
yes.
So more can go towards it. It does mean there might be less for the other 5311 pot of money. So.
Here comes the trade-offs.
Taking into consideration, how do we use this pot of money to effectively meet the needs in our state? And that includes people coming in and out of our state and navigating across.
Yeah.
And feeder services, you were talking about other providers, maybe making those smaller connections. Those are totally eligible and count as part of this service as well. But they need to be connected, and that's what's so important by not letting our study get so old. Make sure that it stays current and keeps us with how things are changing. Things are changing very rapidly in Utah. You have very, fast-growing population, and we need to keep up with that while we can.
And have the vision.
Determination of, like, I don't know, like for our ordinance plans, I don't know where we get this number, but if we stay on a 4-year cycle, is there no suggested cycle for this?
4 years.
Okay.
All planning topics typically are a 4-year cycle. Some are shorter term, like looking out 5 years, and some are longer term, looking out 20 years. But the idea is that they stay updated every 4 years or so.
Yeah. And, oh, go ahead.
I think Utah was working on this when COVID hit, I believe, weren't they?
Yeah.
Well, I wasn't here quite yet, but, yeah, they started it and then COVID happened and it all crapped up.
And you guys got real busy. Oh my gosh.
Mustang, what's the other one? Mustang and
Outrider?
that's primarily state funded.
Yeah, so there's state funds, they use faster dollars, and of course, and they're 5311F, but they have, they kind of had the vision, they have the I-70 and I-20, I-70 and I-25 that have kind of expanded, that's busting, and then Outrider is kind of the getting the rural connections to the busting, which is more the I-70, I-25 system. And I mean, they've really been expanding and ridership's been going crazy, and they have some real fun little things like snow staying that takes you to ski resorts on the weekends. And I still wish the what is it, bus staying to Estes? At some point it was supposed to be elk staying, which I was like super disappointed by. Cindy?
I was just going to say too, just looking at other states that are doing a lot in their intercity bus service, Virginia is another really great state to look at. You can really, they have a lot of really substantial services like Colorado DOT that really connect so many different parts of the state. And it's very impressive.
How are they funding theirs? Is it similar, like state funds? That's, I mean, because like I said, you gotta,
Yeah,
I mean,
I'm not
right?
sure how they're funding it.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
I can't imagine like all that service could be funded out of.
Yeah, right?
It's pretty comprehensive.
And the thing I look at states like that is it's not as many acreages rural as we are.
Mm.
And yeah, it's more upon a European model. And their apportionment, from what I understand, it goes by population. So if you have a huge population, your apportionment for your state is more, not that, I don't think that's the only way they measure it, but I know that's a major part of it is, from what I understand, that it's apportioned by your acreage as well as your population. But some of those smaller states are apportioned a lot greater award than what the like say for example Montana or Idaho is. So I don't know.
Mm-hmm. It is, yeah. The US, all the different things, the options, right? Trying to do apportionments based on a national something is hard in the United States, right? So I think we wanted to include all this information. I think they're maybe providing the presentations for everybody. But first of all, I would like to thank you all for bearing with me as I'm doing a little bit of pinch hitting here in the Colorado, person here. So I appreciate your bearing with me through this. But Jay Aguilar is technically the official kind of project manager with UDOT. He is on vacation, so he's not here. And then, of course, Elena. I'm sure everybody knows Elena. And then this is probably, you've been getting emails, my guess, from Lonnie or somebody on her team at David Evans & Associates. She is the project manager here in Utah. And then I've obviously been working on the project, and my team have been kind of supporting as needed through the project. So again, I think we're actually at time. I don't know how that happened. But again, any other questions or comments, happy to have any additional conversation.